This is our first set of notes in our mini unit on classification. We've actually already studied classification in Unit 1, but I do think it's important to review this unit before the SOL. So hopefully you guys remember that classification is the way that scientists name and group organisms in a logical manner. The science of classification is called taxonomy. And taxonomic relationships, as they're called, are based on physical similarities, chemical makeup, evolutionary relationships, and developmental similarities. If this looks familiar to you, it's because we actually learned in Unit 8 that these four things are the evidences that we have for evolution. So evolution and classification go hand in hand. Carolus Linnaeus was the scientist who first organized and grouped organisms into a 7-level system of classification. Hopefully you remember KPCOFGS, Kingdom, Phylum, Class, Order, Family, Genus, Species. These were the 7 levels of taxonomic classification that Carolus Linnaeus came up with. The kingdom, according to Linnaeus, was the largest group. This was the group that had the most organisms in it. And then it got more specific as you went down. Finally, you get to the genus and the species. Remember that the species refers to a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. This slide here just shows us the hierarchical system. When we look at the kingdom Animalia, we can see that we have everything from grizzly bears to starfish. Then we get into the phylum Chordata. Chordata, these are the organisms that have a backbone. Then we go to the class Mammalia. This happens to be our class. These are animals that have fur, give birth to live young, and have mammary glands. Then our next level is the order Carnivora. We, humans, don't belong to the order Carnivora, but bears do. Okay, so we're looking at the grizzly bear here. Then we go to the family Ursidae. Ursidae is the bear family. These are bears. And then we get to the genus Ursus. And then finally we get to the species Ursus arctos. You will notice that the species is made up of both the genus and the species name. Every level in taxonomy, okay, so each of these levels are called a taxon, and the plural way that you say that is taxa. And when we're looking at these, we can see that a kingdom includes a group of related phyla. All the phylum include groups of related classes, and so on until we get to the species. And the species is called species because it's the most specific. It's very important that you have a mnemonic device to help you remember the hierarchical system of classification. These are 2 examples. King Philip came over 4 great spaghetti, or kids prefer candy over fresh green salad. Linnaeus came up with a 2-word naming system. He called this binomial nomenclature. Binomial means 2, and nomenclature means name. So every species, remember that's our most specific unit, is given a 2-word name, the genus and the species. They can either be underlined or italicized, but they have to be one or the other. And then the first one, the genus name, is always capitalized. So it's important that you can recognize a properly written scientific name. All of these are properly written. Here we have Canis familiaris, That's the scientific name for the dog. And we can see that it's italicized and the genus Canis is capitalized. Canis lupus, this is the scientific name for the wolf. The same thing. We can see that it's italicized, the whole name, and that the genus Canis is capitalized. Our scientific name is Homo sapiens. So instead of italicizing it, in this case we are going to underline it. But we still always capitalize the first name, which is the genus. And then our next scientific name is Felis domesticus, which is the scientific name for the domestic cat. Today, we still use Linnaeus's classification system, but instead of grouping organisms together based on their physical similarities, we have more information about their evolutionary relationships, and so that is how we group organisms together. A cladogram is a diagram that shows the evolutionary relationships among organisms. What we are looking at here is which ones are more closely related. To the left of the screen, you're going to see a little cladogram. Okay, the organisms here are the ones that are most closely related to each other. The numbers represent common ancestors. Here's another example of a cladogram for crabs, barnacles, and limpets. Previously, we had classified them based on their visible similarities. So you can see that based on their physical similarities, the barnacle and limpet look very similar to each other, and so they look like they would belong in the same space on the cladogram. But actually, barnacles are crustaceans like crabs. So the correct way to classify the barnacle, the crab, and the limpet is to show the evolutionary relationship between the crab and the barnacle. And limpets are gastropods, so they're off in a category on their own. All right, and here we have another example of a cladogram. In this cladogram here, we have different types of vertebrates. When you're looking at all of these organisms, on the bottom you will see some derived characteristics. The derived characteristics that we are looking at are jaws, lungs, claws and nails, fur and mammary glands, and feathers. If you find an organism above that derived characteristic, like the chimpanzee here, he's going to have all of these traits, right? When we look at chimpanzees, we know that they have fur, mammary glands, claws or nails, lungs, and jaws. If we look at the lizard here, he is below fur and mammary glands, but he is above claws and nails, lungs, or jaws. So the lizard has all of these characteristics, but he does not have fur and mammary glands. So hopefully you remember that in evolution we talked about homology when we're looking at homologous structures, and then also how molecular biology supports evidence for evolution. Remember that homology, we are looking at organisms with homologous structures, and we tend to group those organisms together. Remember that homologous means that they have the same origin. And so when we look at the bones of the arms in the human, wings in birds, or the flippers in whales and dolphins, they are all composed of the same bones. Okay, these are homologous structures. We can also use molecular biology to determine the taxonomic relationships between organisms. Organisms with similar DNA are grouped together. For example, chimps and humans have about 98% of the same DNA. So 98% of their DNA is identical. Classification can change. If we find new evidence, such as molecular evidence, we might classify organisms in a different way. Okay, so we can find new discoveries that can change these taxonomic relationships. So when we're looking at this phylum here, we see the phylum Chordata. That's our phylum. And if we're looking, we can see that overall, all of these organisms belong to one domain. The domain that we belong to is Eukarya. Okay, and that's because we are all made up of eukaryotic cells. The kingdom that we belong to is Animalia. The phylum that we belong to is Chordata. And chordates are organisms that have a dorsal nerve cord, like us. Okay, then we have different classes of organisms in this picture. Okay, so this is a cladogram for the family Felidae. We can see that the family Felidae has the ability to purr. They have retractable claws. They have carnivorous teeth, and they have fur. A tool that scientists use in the field to classify organisms is called a dichotomous key. Because of the great diversity of life, scientists use these dichotomous keys to identify species. A dichotomous key uses a series of yes or no questions to identify organisms using defining characteristics, such as words or pictures. They are called dichotomous keys because they always have two choices. You can either go to this choice or you can go to the other choice. Or it's either yes or no. Here's an example of a very simple dichotomous key. If we look at this dichotomous key and we look at this organism here, let's pretend that we've never seen this organism. We're going to start at number 1. Does it have feathers? If it has feathers, you'd go to number 2. But it looks like this organism doesn't have feathers, so we are going to go to number 3. When we go to number 3, either it has no legs or it has a shell. Our organism has both legs or appendages and it has a shell, so therefore it must be a turtle. Okay, and we got to this step by going through a system of yes or no answers. Let's try this organism right here. This organism does have feathers, so since it has feathers, we are going to go to number 2. Then we need to decide whether or not it has webbed feet. This animal does not have webbed feet, so it must be a chicken. Today, you are going to create your own cladogram and you are going to practice using a dichotomous key. Please refer to your notes if you have any questions.